I'm going to start with a Bible reading, and I'm turning to the book of Acts and chapter 17. Now, in this passage, the Apostle Paul, as he's traveling around Europe, has arrived in Athens, and he's been invited to talk to some of the leaders of that city. And this is what he says. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God, in the hope that they might feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own prophets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God has overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." So Paul went out from their midst. But some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Meaning making is vital to us. It's actually what we do, and it's something that we do all the time. We are constantly taking the raw materials of our experiences and crafting them into sometimes very elaborate meanings. No matter how small or large the experience is, we will always make some kind of sense out of it. It's how we manage our relationships, it's how we manage the future, we plan for the future, and it's how actually we manage also our mental well-being. Humans are meaning-making animals. And you can see how natural it is for us when we go through really tough experiences. If during an experience of, say, bereavement or the threat of death, for example, we are unable to make some kind of sense of that event, then according to recent research, we are more likely to suffer some kind of long-lasting psychological difficulty as a result. Making meaning out of life's experience is as vital to us as eating. If we go without it, then we suffer. So how do we go about making this all-important meaning? Well, the first thing we need is a framework around which we can build meaning out of what happens to us. Think of a large modern building. Any large modern building will have a framework made usually out of steel. And this framework carries the weight of that building and shows the kind of the shape of the building as well. And everything is built around that framework. So the walls are filled in between the steel parts of that building, and the floors are put onto it. The whole of the building hangs from the steel framework, gets its strength from the framework and gets its shape from the framework. And we all need a framework from which we can build the meaning that we need for our lives. And when I'm talking about a framework, what I mean is beliefs about the kind of world that we live in, beliefs about the kind of person we are, beliefs about God. These ultimate beliefs, these ultimate meanings of our lives. What is more, not only do we need a framework, but we all have a framework. And around that framework, we construct the meaning that is peculiar and specific and vital to all our lives. Now, in the reading that we just had, the Apostle Paul, as we saw, is in Athens. And he sees there a people struggling to make meaning out of their lives, struggling to make meaning because the framework that they have just isn't up to the job. As he walks through the city, he sees temple after temple, altar after altar, all to different gods. It's as though the Athenians just didn't really know who they were or what they were about. And so they keep trying to patch up their meaning-making framework with a new god here, a new god there. In their desperation, they even had an altar to the unknown God. They knew, it seems that they knew, their way of understanding the world and understanding themselves just didn't work. It wasn't robust enough, it wasn't sophisticated enough for the complexities of life. Maybe there was a God out there who would help them make sense of it all for them. And so Paul comes to them as the messenger of that unknown God. Messenger of that God who can give meaning to life, who can furnish them with a framework to understand what it means to be them. And among the things that he says about God, 3 things in particular stand out for me. The first of these is that he tells us that we are all God's children. And what this means is that we derive our existence from God. As Paul says, in him we live, move, and have our being. And so our quest for a framework around which to build the meaning of our lives begins right here. It begins with the God who is the source of our very existence. And this is good news, because in calling God our Father, Paul is also emphasizing that this God, who is the basis of our meaning in life, loves us and is committed to us. As St. Augustine said, we are restless until we rest in God. The second thing that strikes me about what Paul says is that God is known in Jesus. The unknown God has invited every person to look, to see, and to know him in the life of Jesus Christ, to see in him the kind of God who's made us and who gives us meaning and purpose in life. And what we see in the life of Jesus when we do look is love, compassion, a passion for justice, a passion for people, a commitment to truth, and a commitment to the salvation of the human race. In Jesus, the God we see and the God we know is the God who is love, who is compassion, the God who is committed to bringing justice for the exploited, the marginalized, and the oppressed, a God whose passion for the human race is seen in the greatness of the salvation that he gifts to us. This is one way in which we can understand what Paul says about judgment in this mini sermon. The sheer quality of Jesus' life creates a moment of critical choice for us. How do we respond to what he shows us about God? It's as though Jesus is summoning us to a decision point. Well, do you want to know God or not? The use we make of our lives depends on our response to what God has shown us, to what God has shown us about who he is, to what God has shown us in the person of Jesus Christ. It is as critical as this. Jesus gives our lives the meaning we need. And the third thing that strikes me about what Paul says about God in this passage is that one event in the life of Jesus above all others defines who this God is. And because of that as well, I guess, who we are. And that event is the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus gives us meaning in our lives. God is working in Jesus Christ towards the renewal of absolutely everything. You see, resurrection, well, it is what God is doing in this world right now. This is what Jesus shows us about us all. Each of us has been created in order to flourish in life. That's why we are here, so that we can flourish, so that we can abound and to encourage an abundance of life in others and in the world. Every one of us is called to work for the renewal and the flourishing of life. The life of our family, our friends, our communities, the environment, the whole of creation, so that everything and everyone might share in the life of God. The idea of resurrection, as we read, scandalized some of these ancient Athenians. Maybe their long and fruitless search for meaning had made them a bit cynical. And this was just too much meaning, too much life for them to handle. As for us, well, I guess at the moment we need to make meaning out of our experiences, perhaps more than ever. Instead of an abundance of life, we're experiencing death and illness on a truly horrifying scale. What can possibly make meaning and give us purpose in this? Well, it's especially at times like these that God comes to us through Jesus Christ with an invitation to know him. The love of God, the God of love, to know his compassion and to know his justice, but also, and crucially, to know him, the God of life, the God of resurrection. God invites us to hope because resurrection and renewal is what happens in a world in which Jesus is raised from the dead.